Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more. And today we're going to continue with part 2 of our LucasArts video game coverage, which we've decided has to be split into 3 parts because we just can't fit this all into 2, so to speak. So we got another week of this to look forward to, or not, depending on your sensibilities. Real quick, a couple games that we missed last time that I did want to touch on was Rebel Assault, which I think my mouse pad is still from, like the one that I used today was part of the rollout of that. I never really mastered it, and I had it on computer, but I don't really recall much of it. I don't think I cared for it much, and I much preferred Rogue Squadron for 64. And then there were the Super Star Wars, Super Empire, Super Return of the Jedi games, which were awesome, but extremely difficult. And I remember that for one, in Super Star Wars, there was like a secret place in the first level where you could find a way to like earn 20 extra lives or something, but then you had to jump off the cliff in order to get back to it. So you would go down, get 20 lives, jump off the cliff. Go down, get 20 lives, jump off the cliff. And you sacrifice 1 for 19, right? Something like that. And that was the only way I was able to beat that game. Anyway, loved them all. But let's move on. As you remember from the last episode, we were leaving off in the 2000s, which saw numerous tie-in games to episode 1, obviously, like Jedi Power Battles, Starfighter, and Racer. Most of these faced mixed to average reactions at the time, although Racer has gone on to have something of a cult following. It was cool. It was like Mario Kart for Star Wars. And the races in the games lasted almost as long as they did in episode 1. So it was, it was almost like you were playing in real time. I remember playing the episode 1 game on PlayStation, just so caught in the hype of it, even though the game was pretty terrible. But anyway, it was really from 2002 onwards that the golden age of LucasArts began. Bounty Hunter, a prequel to episode 2 showing Jango Fett's earlier years as a bounty hunter, garnered excellent reviews and has undergone a surge in popularity with the release of The Mandalorian. I also had to say I enjoy it more than I enjoy The Mandalorian, but you guys know how I feel about that show. It's fine. It used a third-person setup and was nothing exceptional in any one category, but all of its elements came together to make a pretty solid, fun third-person shooter. 2003 saw a collaboration with Sony for the release of Star Wars Galaxies, a massive multiplayer online game set during the time frame of the original trilogy. The game allowed players to pick from numerous species and classes and really immerse themselves in the most popular era of Star Wars. The game saw numerous expansions and updates and enjoyed a long and healthy life until it was eventually shut down in 2011. But by far, the biggest Star Wars game of the year, if not ever, came from BioWare, who developed the game for LucasArts' Knights of the Old Republic. It was an RPG set thousands of years before the movies, when the Sith were an army and the Jedi were true guardians of peace and justice, far before they lost their way. It has countless characters, thousands of lines of dialogue, and one of the greatest twists in video game history. The player's nameless, slightly mysterious character is revealed to be none other than the popular character Darth Revan himself. The combat uses the Dungeons and Dragons system and is notoriously clunky and difficult to master, but by all accounts the game was a smash success and is largely considered to be one of the greatest video games ever made. I went out and bought an Xbox specifically for this game. I was always a PlayStation guy, but the way that the word of mouth was traveling about how good this game was, I couldn't resist. I had to go out and get it. So I bought the whole system just to play this game. It's also like the first time I remember playing something and at the end of it I was like, oh my god, like at the twist. And the fact that you were able to kind of control your destiny between light side and dark side, mixed with the elements of lore that they pulled from both from the EU as well as the original trilogy, in addition to some of the stuff that was going on in the Dark Horse comics, really resulted in a kind of all-encompassing, fan-servicey in all the right ways Star Wars game. In 2019, Lucasfilm President Kathleen Kennedy even confirmed the era was being looked at for possible live-action content, and rumor is a script has even been written. In 2004, LucasArts President Simon Jeffrey, who had held his position since 2000, was replaced with Jim Ward. Ward was tasked with bringing the studio up to par. Despite its success in the last year, it was felt the studio's output was not proportionate to what it should bring back in. After a huge audit, it was revealed the company had brought in $100 million, not enough for a game studio, and one with such an output. Ward cut back staff from 450 to 190, closed down several in-development games, and began to prioritize in-studio Star Wars blockbusters as opposed to licenses, as with the Old Republic. One of the unfortunate casualties of this was Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords. Though it is quite fondly remembered, LucasArts mandated it be ready for holiday 2004. This meant the entire game was made in around 14 months. While its story and characters were again acclaimed, its combat was carried wholesale from the previous game, and it launched in a massively unfinished state. Even playing the game, I remember being kind of befuddled when I got to the end and it kind of ended the way that it did. It always felt unfinished. Now, to be fair, it was supposed to be part 2 of a 3-part story. However, it always felt like the end of it was rushed. However, the characters were still awesome. The world was still awesome. And there's content out there about Kriya that is still some of the most thought-provoking and engaging Star Wars content I've ever consumed by someone who truly understands that world and that character. 2004 also saw the release of Star Wars Battlefront, a shooter that allowed players to access multiple planets and armies from the prequel and original trilogy eras. It had been in development since 2002 and proved to be a big success, but its sequel really made the mark. Battlefront 2 launched cross-game generations in 2005. It brought numerous improvements to the original, including space battles. You could duke it out in a starfighter, land back in your capital ship, and load a gunship up with your buddies, then land in the enemy hangar and engage them on foot. It brought nearly every major location from across the saga, including the then new Revenge of the Sith, and boasted numerous hero characters. While the professional reviews were somewhat average, Battlefront 2 became a childhood favorite for millions, and to this day, probably the most popular Star Wars game ever made, objectively speaking. Far from my personal favorite, but certainly one with the widest range of accessibility, meaning it offers an awful lot to a very wide range of fans and gamers. Though somewhat dwarfed by Battlefront, the same year saw the great success of Republic Commando. Developed entirely in-house, a tactical first-person shooter, it put players in control of Delta Squad, an elite Republic Commando unit during the Clone Wars. It had a down-and-dirty, boots-on-the-ground feel, a unique rock soundtrack, a great cast of characters, including Mr. Morrison, and features probably the best-ever squad gameplay of any first-person shooter, at the very least that I've played. Delta Squad became a fan favorite and made a canon-making cameo appearance in the Clone Wars in 2011. It launched a book series, Karen Travis's Republic Commando novels, and the Commando is even a playable unit in DICE's 2017 Battlefront 2. A sequel, Imperial Commando, was planned, but unfortunately never made it off the ground. The characters even got 3 3/4 figures, which were difficult to track down and go for a pricey late tax on the aftermarket, and I'd love to see them carried over into the Black Series. The Episode 3 video game saw what was until recently the best lightsaber fighting game ever made, and laid a lot of the groundwork for what was used in the recent Fallen Order. It also came out slightly before Episode 3, and I played it knowing that it would spoil me and not caring. 2005 also saw the release of LEGO Star Wars, followed by a sequel in 2006. Developed by Traveler's Tales for Lucasfilm, it brought a comedic retelling of the Star Wars saga and proved to be exceedingly popular. It began a franchise with the Clone Wars, The Force Awakens, and the Skywalker saga, which is due to launch this year. 2007 was probably the company's quietest year. The plan for more in-house games was coming together, and the studio was hard at work on The Force Unleashed, which launched the following year. Spearheaded by Hayden Blackman, who worked on Star Wars Galaxies and had written several Star Wars comics. It put the player in control of Darth Vader's secret apprentice, Starkiller, played by future Darth Maul voice actor Sam Witwer. The game imagined an amped-up version of the Force, which would allow the player to perform insane feats. It utilized cutting-edge destructive elements in animation design. The story was extensive, charting the progression of the insanely powerful Starkiller from Sith apprentice to rebellion hero, with George Lucas providing insight and even publicly promoting the game. Speaking of promotions, Lucasfilm marketed it as a multimedia event with a novel, comic book, and numerous toys. All the merchandise of a movie without the movie. Similar to Shadows of the Empire. The game's reviews were generally positive but slightly mixed, but it was a smash success, selling over 6 million copies by mid-2009. A sequel was quickly announced, launching in 2010. Unfortunately, it was largely a failure with an incredibly short campaign and half-back story. The game's success led to it being fast-tracked with only about 9 months of development, an incredibly short time for a video game. The story was written in only 3 weeks, it ended on a cliffhanger, and a third game was planned, but more on that later. This character was crazy popular, but he never really did much for me. I enjoyed the games and still enjoy them to this day, honestly. I played them actually fairly recently. But while he's kind of a fan favorite, I never quite got it. The badassery of it, as it were, seemed very surface level and kind of fan servicey in all the wrong ways. Or maybe not wrong, but perhaps hollow. Always dug the game, just never quite understood the obsession with the character. But The Force Unleashed 2 was symptomatic of the problems at LucasArts. The studio saw several changes in presidents, more layoffs, and a generally somewhat dysfunctional setting. Word is, communication between the studio and the higher-ups was inefficient, with the Lucasfilm brass largely not understanding the reality of video game production. The studio was also totally answerable to George Lucas, who largely took a hands-off approach, giving them a lot of freedom, but was as always the man in charge who had to be pleased no matter what. The rest of the year's games were relatively quiet. Several tie-ins to the Clone Wars, such as the awful Republic Heroes, have largely faded into obscurity. 2011 saw the launch of BioWare's third Star Wars outing, The Old Republic, a massively multiplayer online game. The game itself was somewhat criticized for not being a direct sequel to the prior two, but proved to be a big success and is still fairly popular even today. Meanwhile, for those of us that wanted Knights of the Old Republic Part 3, we had to settle for Mass Effect 1 and 2, which were great, and the rest, which were also called Mass Effect. Another licensed game came in 2012 with Kinect Star Wars. Microsoft and Xbox made a big deal of their new Kinect add-on, a hands-free sensor and controller that had a massive marketing rollout behind it. Unfortunately, the appliance itself was notoriously buggy and largely considered a fad. For those of you wondering why licensed games were allowed even as the shift to in-house games continued, the answer was money, as is often the answer with things. Lucasfilm was a privately owned company, and George had to use the Star Wars brand to bring in revenue and keep people in their jobs. Licensed games allowed a solid financial return with virtually no risk to Lucasfilm, and also kept the Star Wars flame alive in time with no movies. LucasArts had been continuing to shift towards entirely in-house games like Republic Commando and The Force Unleashed. Force Unleashed 2 and the decline of Star Wars in the late 2010s meant the studio was beginning to fade from the gaming landscape, overshadowed by Call of Duty, Halo, Gears of War, and Uncharted. But the studio was planning something of a comeback. Star Wars 1313 was a third-person Uncharted-style shooter set in the seedy underbelly of Coruscant between the events of Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. I recently made a diorama of the imagined 1313, and you can see it here while we talk a little bit more about it. Lucas gave suggestions on its story, particularly the Coruscant setting, as it was originally planned to tie in to the canceled Underworld show. It would follow a bounty hunter, motion captured and played by Wilson Bethel, who played Bullseye in Netflix Daredevil. It was to feature a darker, more mature story and use cutting-edge technology from ILM. It was planned to be a massive comeback for the studio and was 2 years into development and all set to reveal at E3 2012. 2 months before the reveal, Lucas suddenly mandated the game star Boba Fett. This was despite years of story, gameplay, and casting, payment, and recording of actors. The reasons, too, are largely unknown. It appears he simply changed his mind and saying no was not an option, because he's a complete lunatic. The implications of this on the game were massive. The E3 demo was already ready to go and could not be changed in time. This meant the world would not be seeing the game as it would actually launch, and even what it was really about. As LucasArts scrambled to meet George's demand, they decided to have the protagonist suddenly killed off early in the game by Boba Fett, with the player assuming the role from then on. The E3 showcase was hugely successful. LucasArts kept a tight lip on the game's story and protagonist, giving it an air of mystery to cover the insane scramble behind the scenes. In September of that year, LucasArts had its hiring frozen. The team was confused and apparently uninformed as to why. Then, on October 30th, Lucas sold the franchise to Disney, to the surprise of the public and LucasArts. Disney CEO Bob Iger began an evaluation of the company from top to bottom, but instructed LucasArts to continue development in the interim. In April 2013, LucasArts was formally shut down, making 1313 one of the most famous canceled games of all time. Over 150 employees lost their jobs. Following this, the Disney era of games began, one mired in controversy with mismanagement from licensee EA, but there's light at the end of all this, and it's coming in part 3. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying sane. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care. It's a cliffhanger, Joe!